Chapter 1: A City Born from Exile. A queen's escape from Tyre weaves a tale of heartbreak and destiny, planting the soul of Carthage in the soil of North Africa. The stars above the eastern Mediterranean shimmered with secrets, and among them travelled a woman who bore the weight of both royalty and ruin. Her name was Elissa, though the Romans would come to call her Dido, and her journey, born of sorrow and resistance, would seed a city that would one day rival the greatest empires of the world. Elissa had been a princess of Tyre, that proud Phoenician port nestled in the crags of the Levant. A city of cedar and sea, of traders and purple dyes, where ships whispered across the waves and palaces sang with incense and intrigue. But her fate was not to remain among its gilded halls. After the death of her husband, Acabas, murdered by her brother, King Pygmalion, for gold and power, Elissa fled. Her grief did not shatter her. It shaped her. With a fleet of loyal followers and a spirit too large for grief alone to hold, she sailed westward across the wide mouth of the Mediterranean, past the islands of Cyprus and Crete, past mythic shores and unseen gods, into a world where legend still breathed. She reached the coast of North Africa, and it was there, in a land of golden sands and salt-kissed winds, that Elissa would begin again. Not as a widow, not as a refugee, but as a founder. The locals knew the land, but they did not know her. They could not see the flame she carried, burning from a past soaked in betrayal and love. Yet history remembers. Because history is shaped not by those who stay, but by those who dare to leave. And Elissa left land measured by oxhide. With wit and legend, Dido claims her kingdom, laying the foundation for one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. The story of how Elissa claimed her kingdom lives more in poetry than parchment, but in every myth there is truth, and in every clever tale a mirror of power. The Berber king Iarbas watched the foreign queen with wary eyes, a woman of ships and strange gods. He offered her land, but only what she could cover with a single ox hide. It was meant as mockery, a test, a warning. But Elissa did not flinch. She accepted. And then, with the patience of a weaver and the mind of a monarch, she cut that ox hide into the thinnest of strips, fine as thread, long as strategy, and laid it out in a vast circle upon a hill near the sea. Within that clever border, she claimed her ground. That place became known as Byrsa, the citadel, and from that strip of hide would rise the city of Carthage. It was not built in haste. It was shaped by hands hardened by exile and softened by vision. Temples were raised to Melkart and Tanit. Streets echoed with footsteps of traders and priests. The scent of salt and smoke drifted through the air, mingling with cedar and myrrh brought from the east. The city's heart beat in quiet strength, and every stone carried the memory of that ox hide, of how power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers through strategy. Sometimes it sings through myth. The land, once given as a joke, became a throne, and the queen, once thought desperate, became legend. Sanctuary in the west. Early Carthage becomes a refuge, its temples, trade routes, and walls rising in harmony with the sea and the sun. Carthage did not grow overnight, but its spirit did. Like vines reaching toward the sun, the city expanded with quiet determination. It became a sanctuary, not just for those who had followed Alyssa, but for others fleeing war, greed, and silence. The westward winds brought them Phoenician merchants, craftsmen, sailors, and dreamers, and Carthage, framed by sea and hill, embraced them. Its harbour was unlike any other in the Western world, an enclosed circular dock engineered with purpose. Warships, merchant vessels, and fishing boats found home here, their sails rising like wings, their masts echoing prayers to distant stars. Temples crowned the heights, built with sandstone and secrets, to Baal-Hamon, the god of time and fire, to Tanit, the mother, the protector, the flame of life. Her image, etched in stone and bone, guarded thresholds and hearts. Carthage's walls were not merely defences, they were symbols. They were stories carved in masonry of exiles who found peace, of merchants who found fortune, of priests who found purpose. The city's streets wound like rivers, carrying spices, ivory, glass, and gold. Its markets sang in many tongues: Punic, Greek, Numidian, Egyptian. And in the hush of dusk, when the sun sank behind the waves and lit the sea with amber fire, the city seemed to breathe, alive, eternal. Early Carthage was not yet an empire, but it was more than a city. It was a beacon, from legend to legacy. Even as myth softens into history, the story of Dido endures, etched in poetry, stone, and the heart of a people. Time, like the tide, softens all things. Stories blur, stones erode, names fade, but Dido did not. Long after her voice fell silent, her name lived on, first in temple hymns, then in sailors' tales, and eventually in the verses of poets. Virgil, writing centuries later in the Aeneid, painted her as both lover and ghost, a queen abandoned by Aeneas, her heart pierced by betrayal, her pyre lighting the night sky. It was a Roman version, a myth reshaped by the victors, but even that cannot erase her. Because in Carthage, she was not tragedy. She was memory. Coins bore her image, noble, serene. Statues, though worn by rain and sun, still stood where her feet once touched the earth. Her spirit became the soul of Carthage, a reminder of beginnings born from endings, of strength rooted in sorrow. And in every prayer offered at dawn, in every ship that left the harbour with eyes turned east, in every mother who whispered old stories to her child, Dido lived. Her exile became a foundation, her cleverness a lesson, her courage a compass. And the city she planted in the soil of exile would rise over centuries into a power the world could not ignore, but that would come later. For now there was a hill wrapped in oxhide, a queen wrapped in silence, and a people wrapped in promise. The sun dipped low. The sea sighed, and Carthage, still young, still sacred, dreamt. Chapter 2: Sea Lords of the Western Mediterranean. Carthaginian seafarers expand their reach, inheriting the maritime brilliance of their Tyrian ancestors. Before Carthage had walls, it had sails. Long before her armies marched across foreign lands, her ships carved soft lines across the sea. In the breath between land and horizon, the spirit of Tyre lived on, reborn in Carthage's wooden hulls and curved prows, painted eyes staring outward into the unknown. The Phoenicians were born of the sea, and Carthage, daughter of Tyre, carried that same calling in her blood. The wind did not frighten her people, it beckoned them. Every breeze was an invitation, every current a whisper of opportunity. The Carthaginians did not resist the sea. They listened to it, studied it, loved it. From their harbours in Byrsa, fleets of slender ships would slip quietly into the dawn, their sails catching morning light like silent prayers. These were not ships of war, at least not yet. These were ships of trade, of contact, of curiosity. They knew how to read the stars, not as distant fires, but as guides, celestial map makers pulling invisible ropes across the sky. They could tell when a storm would come, not by thunder, but by a certain stiffness in the wind, a subtle shift in the breath of the sea. Carthaginian navigators traced the paths once laid by their Phoenician ancestors, paths that stretched along the African coast, up into Sicily, through the narrow throat of the Strait of Gibraltar, and out into the restless waters of the western Mediterranean. But they did not merely follow. They expanded. They pushed farther. They built lighthouses along jagged cliffs. They taught foreign fishermen new ways to preserve their catch. They traded purple dye, fine linen, olive oil, incense, and the memory of Tyre. With every voyage they left behind not just goods, but fingerprints of their growing presence. In these early centuries, Carthage was not yet a conqueror, but it was already a master of the winds. Islands and opportunity Corsica, Sardinia, and the Balearics become stepping stones in Carthage's growing economic web. The Western Sea held more than just water. It held islands, green, mountainous, and waiting. To the north, Corsica rose from the sea like a fortress. West of it, Sardinia loomed, its rivers flowing through rich forests and mineral-laden hills. And farther still, the Balearic Islands, rugged, sun-drenched stones scattered like ancient offerings. These were not barren rocks, they were stations, stepping stones, anchors in a world of movement. To Carthage, each island was an opportunity, not just for trade, but for rhythm, a rhythm of resupply, of contact, of quiet expansion. The Phoenicians had known these lands, but it was Carthage that tied them together with stronger thread. In Corsica, Carthaginians traded with the native peoples, sharing pottery, tools, and language. In Sardinia, they found iron, silver, and grain. Mines pulsed with potential, and Carthage, always attentive, sent ships filled with workers, guards, and priests. Temples followed, small at first, shrines of stone, of burnt offerings and whispered prayers. Over time, these islands became extensions of Carthage itself, ports fortified with thick walls, harbours shaped to cradle their ships, markets humming with the noise. Of many tongues, in the Balearics they found a different treasure, men, warriors, skilled in slingshot and ambush, fierce and agile. Carthage welcomed them into her armies not as servants, but as professionals, paid fighters, valued and feared. The control was not always military. It was economic, cultural, spiritual. Influence was woven into trade agreements and sealed with offerings to shared gods. Carthage did not shout. It whispered, negotiated, bought, and blessed. Its expansion was not always seen until it was already complete, and so the islands, once distant and disparate, became beads on a necklace the Mediterranean's western heart held firmly in Carthage's hands. The Iberian horizon, beyond the sea, Carthage seeks the wealth of the Spanish mines and the strength of native alliances, but the islands were not enough. Carthage's eyes turned westward again, past the Pillars of Hercules, into the golden promise of Iberia. Here the land changed, no longer islands of refuge, but a vast, rugged continent of mountains, rivers, and peoples. Iberia was wild and rich. It sang with the clang of copper and silver, with the thud of hooves on rocky trails, with the smoke of sacred fires rising from tribal altars. Carthaginian ships crept along the coastline, mapping every inlet, every natural harbour. They saw hills that glittered in the sunlight, not with illusion, but with awe. Silver mines deep beneath the earth. Copper veins stretching like ancient roots. And so they came, not with swords first, but with scales, with goods, with gifts. They built trading posts, small at first, humble. Then towns, then cities. Gadir, now Cadiz, became one of the oldest. A home for traders and seafarers, a gateway to the riches of the interior, but Carthage knew that mines were not enough. People mattered. The Iberian tribes were many: Lusitanians, Celtiberians, Tartessians, each with their own laws, their own gods, their own scars. Carthage did not seek to rule them, not at first. It sought to know them, to respect their power, their rhythms. Alliances were forged not just with words, but with marriages, with shared ceremonies, with bronze tools and painted amphorae. Carthage learned their dialects, studied their customs, fought with them against mutual foes, and from these friendships came soldiers. Iberian warriors, brave and skilled, became part of the Carthaginian machine. They wore their own armor, carried their own traditions, but when they marched beneath Carthage's command. In Iberia, Carthage found more than wealth. It found strength, a second heart, a new rhythm. And though Rome would one day see Iberia as a battleground, Carthage first saw it as a partner. The horizon had widened, and Carthage had followed it west. Gold, grain, and gods. Every voyage carries not just goods, but gods, rituals, and the invisible strings of empire. From Tyre to Carthage, from Carthage to Corsica, to Iberia, to shores unnamed, every ship that left port carried more than merchandise. It carried belief. The empire of Carthage was not built with bricks alone. It was built with meaning. Merchants prayed before setting sail, not for wealth, but for wind, for safe passage, for the favor of Baal-Hamon and Tanit. Their names were carved into amulets, whispered into sea foam, scrawled on the backs of ledgers and receipts. In every new city, a sanctuary was raised, sometimes small, sometimes grand. These were not tools of conversion, they were reminders, markers of presence, of continuity. Carthage did not demand the erasure of other gods. Instead, it added its own. It layered belief upon belief, creating a rich spiritual mosaic. Offerings were left in hidden groves by rivers, in caves. Rituals were shared between cultures, each adapting, adjusting, accepting. And so the gods moved across the sea as quietly and persistently as the traders themselves. In every port where Carthaginian hands touched stone, a part of Carthage lived. But it was not only gods that travelled. It was grain, food, sustenance. Carthage became known for its agricultural expertise. Its engineers developed irrigation systems, crop rotations, granaries shaped for airflow and preservation. This knowledge travelled just as surely as any ship, and gold, whether mined in Iberia or gained through trade, glimmered in the accounts of scribes and the offerings of temples. Wealth was not hoarded, but used for more ships, for more treaties, for more influence. The invisible strings of empire were drawn tight not by conquest alone, but by consistency. A consistency of presence, of belief, of economy. From the simplest jug of olive oil to the most sacred relic, every item that crossed the sea carried the weight of Carthage's identity. It was not yet an empire in name, but it was in essence. Carthage had become more than a city. It had become a rhythm, one that moved with the sea, whispered with the wind, and reached farther with every passing season. And in the hush of night, when the sails were furled and the hearths burned low, the people of Carthage could rest, knowing that tomorrow the ships would sail again. Chapter 3: Between Rome and the Rising Tide. Rome and Carthage once stood as distant partners, two giants unaware of the storm ahead. There was a time, long before swords clashed and fire fell from the sky, when Carthage and Rome were simply neighbors. Not close ones, not yet rivals, but distant presences moving in their own orbits like moons around different planets. Carthage by then was already old. She had grown from a refugee's dream into a seafaring power whose reach touched islands, coastlines, and hearts. Her ships danced across the western sea, bringing grain from Africa, silver from Iberia, glass from Sidon, and the steady hum of her gods. Rome, in contrast, was younger, still gathering its strength. A city on 7 hills, slowly uniting the tribes of the Italian peninsula through treaties, battles, and the slow gravity of ambition. While Carthage looked outward across oceans, Rome had looked inward at its mountains, its neighbors, its soil. But the world was changing, and rivers of trade, power, and fear began to bend their courses toward one another. Their first meeting were not violent. In fact, they were diplomatic. In the early 4th century BCE, Carthage and Rome signed treaties, mutual understandings carved into bronze and sealed with intention. These documents outlined trade rights, limits of movement, and promises of peace. They were practical, even friendly, as if both cities recognized in the other a kindred fire. For years they remained content to share the Mediterranean, Rome in the center, Carthage in the west. The sea was wide enough. The ambitions, though great, had not yet collided. But neighbors do not remain distant forever. Growth, by its nature, narrows space. And even the calmest waters can one day stir. Waves of influence. As their spheres expand, the sea becomes narrower, the silence tenser. The Mediterranean, once vast and full of promise, began to feel smaller. Carthage extended its reach north and west, strengthening ties in Iberia, reinforcing its presence in Sardinia and Corsica, and deepening its roots in Sicily. Every new outpost was a ripple in the water, every treaty with a local king a new thread in a growing web. Rome too was growing. After defeating the Samnites and Etruscans, it looked southward and outward. The Italian peninsula, once divided, was beginning to beat as one heart. Roman roads stretched like veins. Its laws brought order, its armies brought fear, and its language carried the voice of something new. Unity. Carthage began to notice Rome's reach, creeping toward the sea. And Rome, in turn, saw Carthage's sails drawing closer to its shores. What was once shared territory became uncertain terrain. Nowhere was this tension clearer than in Sicily. Sicily, rich, fertile, strategically placed, stood between the two powers like a prize. Carthage had long held cities there, forming alliances, with local rulers and building temples to its gods. Rome, seeing opportunity, began forming its own connections, quiet ones, careful ones. The island became a mirror. It reflected not just geography, but ambition. Carthage saw it as part of its world. Rome began to see it as a gateway to its future. The sea that once separated them now connected them, and that connection, like a tightened rope, began to strain. Ships passed one another in the strait, sometimes trading, sometimes watching. Each port, each new alliance, each troop movement sent a message, a language of influence and intention spoken without words. The silence between Rome and Carthage was no longer empty. It was heavy, and it would not stay silent for long. The dance of diplomacy, treaties and trade masks unease as alliances quietly fray. In these years before the storm, diplomacy was both shield and sword. Rome and Carthage continued to sign agreements, each treaty another thread in a fragile tapestry of peace. One treaty limited Carthaginian movement near Italy, but allowed Roman traders access to North Africa. Another treaty confirmed Carthaginian control of its western territories, while recognizing Roman interests on the mainland. These documents were careful, measured, legal. But underneath, the soil was shifting. Alliances were the first to fray. Rome's support for certain Sicilian cities challenged Carthaginian influence. Carthage, in turn, offered aid to enemies of Rome's allies. It was a quiet tug-of-war played in shadows and letters, not yet in blood. Ambassadors came and went, bearing gifts and guarded words. Banquets were held in each other's honor, tables heavy with roasted meats, honeyed wines and calculated smiles. But behind the pleasantries was something else. An awareness, a question. Who would blink first? Neither city wanted war. Yet both cities knew they could not stop growing. And with every new port, every ally won or lost, the dance grew more urgent. Carthage had always mastered negotiation. Her leaders were seasoned traders, raised to read silence as carefully as speech. They knew how to offer enough without giving everything. They knew how to delay, to soften, to shift blame. Rome was learning. Its diplomats, once rustic, had grown sharper. They spoke with the clarity of law, the firmness of legionnaires. Their city did not move quickly, but when it did not retreat. For a time, this dance held. Treaties renewed, agreements expanded, trade flowed. But underneath, something old and deep was rising, distrust. And it waited quietly, like a tide before the storm. Watching the waters boil, before the first clash there is a long, quiet simmer, felt in glances, envoys and unsaid words. The years before the First Punic War are often lost in the shadow of what came after, but they deserve remembering, because in these silent years the future was already being written. It was not yet war, it was not yet open hostility, but it was something close, a long simmering unease. In Sicily, tensions sharpened. The Mamertines, a band of mercenaries who had seized the city of Messana, found themselves caught between two giants. They reached out to Rome for help, then to Carthage. Both powers hesitated, both considered, both knew that choosing to act or to wait could break the fragile peace. In North Africa, Roman traders were welcomed but watched. Carthaginian markets were rich but cautious. Every deal carried with it the scent of suspicion. Were these buyers or spies? In the Roman Senate, debates grew louder. Some senators saw Carthage as a threat, too powerful, too silent, too strange. Others argued for patience, for treaties, for caution. And in Carthage, the same discussions unfolded. Was Rome merely another partner in trade? Or was it a rival in disguise, a city whose hunger would one day turn westward? The waters boiled slowly, not in tempests but in whispers. A single letter delayed, a fort built too close to a border, a ship detained for questions that were never answered. Little things, unremarkable things. Until one day, they weren't. The people did not yet speak of war, but they sensed it, in the air, in the narrowed eyes of merchants, in the quiet increase of soldiers stationed near the coasts. There were no battles yet, but the decisions made in these quiet years would shape the ones to come, because peace is not only the absence of war, it is a choice, a balance, a pause, and sometimes that pause ends. Chapter 4: The First Punic War. A mercenary scuffle in Sicily spirals into the first great war between titans. The fires of great wars rarely begin with thunder. Often they start as embers, small, unnoticed, easy to ignore, until they flare beyond control. So it was in Sicily in the year 264 BCE, when the ancient calm between Rome and Carthage gave way to the rumble of iron. Sicily had long been a land of crossroads. Greek colonies, native tribes, and Phoenician outposts had woven its fabric for centuries. Its fields were fertile, its ports busy, its cities well watched by foreign eyes. For Carthage, parts of the island had become home, extensions of its growing network. For Rome, Sicily represented potential, proximity, power. In the city of Messana, on the northeastern edge of the island, a group of mercenaries known as the Mamertines had seized control. These former soldiers, originally hired to protect the city, turned their blades against their employers and took it for themselves. Surrounded by stronger powers, they now found themselves vulnerable and desperate. They sent envoys in both directions, east to Syracuse, west to Carthage, and across the narrow strait to Rome. Carthage responded quickly, sending a small force to occupy the harbour, a move not of conquest, but of control, to protect their interests, to ensure their presence. Rome hesitated, but only briefly. There was debate in the Senate. Some called for caution, others for intervention. But the lure was strong, a foothold in Sicily, a chance to counterbalance Carthaginian influence. Rome answered the call, and so what began as a local dispute spiraled. Carthaginian forces clashed with Roman legions outside the gates of Messana. There was no formal declaration, no grand speeches, just swords, shields, and silence broken. The First Punic War had begun. It would last 23 years, and in that time, two great powers would learn what it truly meant to face one another, not in trade, not in treaties, but in total war. Warfare at sea. Naval battles redefine power, as Carthage's ancient skill is challenged by Roman innovation. On land, Rome was seasoned, disciplined legions, methodical marches, unyielding formations. But on water, Carthage was the master. For centuries, its sailors had ruled the waves. Its warships, sleek and fast, were feared from Iberia to the Levant. The early years of the war proved this strength. Carthaginian vessels dominated the sea lanes, cutting Roman supply lines, escorting troops and asserting control. Their crews, drawn from generations of seafarers, moved like shadows across the waves. They knew how to fight with ships, not just on them. Rome struggled. It had no true navy. It had few experienced sailors, but it had something else: resolve. Realizing the war could not be won on land alone, Rome built. It studied captured Carthaginian ships, copying their designs with Roman precision. Within months, an entire fleet emerged, unseasoned but ready. The first naval clashes were brutal. Roman inexperience showed. Carthaginian agility overwhelmed their opponents. Forces mounted, but Rome did not break. It adapted. The Romans approached sea warfare as they did everything else, as a problem to be solved, not with tradition, but with invention. The war shifted from shore to open water. Harbors became battlegrounds. Islands became fortresses. Every grain shipment, every troop movement was now part of a broader struggle. Carthage still held the advantage, but the gap was closing. Rome was learning, changing, evolving. The tides were beginning to shift, not just on the sea, but in the minds of both nations. Iron on water, the corvus, a Roman invention, turns the tide, bridging ships into battlegrounds. Rome's answer to Carthaginian naval supremacy came not from the depths of the sea, but from the logic of its generals. If they could not outmaneuver Carthaginian ships, they would bring the land to the sea. The corvus was born from this idea, a long pivoting plank mounted at the bow of a Roman ship. At its end, a heavy spike. When lowered, it could pierce into an enemy vessel's deck, latching the two ships together. It was not elegant, it was not graceful, but it was Roman. With the corvus, sea battles became extensions of land battles. Once attached, Roman legionaries could storm across the plank, turning naval engagements into infantry clashes, something they understood deeply, something they could win. The impact was immediate. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BCE, Rome deployed its corvus-equipped fleet for the first time. The results were staggering. Carthaginian ships caught off guard found themselves locked in place, their crews overwhelmed by Roman soldiers fighting as if still on solid ground. The victory echoed. Rome had seized the initiative. Carthage, for all its mastery of the sea, now faced an unfamiliar enemy. Not one that played by the old rules, but one that rewrote them. The corvus was not without flaws. In rough seas, it made Roman ships unstable. In later years, many would sink from their own weight. But in these early engagements, its psychological effect was profound. Carthage no longer fought a predictable foe. Rome had turned the sea, once Carthage's sanctuary, into another kind of battlefield. And every Roman ship that sailed with a corvus carried more than soldiers. It carried the message, "We will not fight on your terms, we will make our own." An uneasy peace. Carthage signs peace, not with surrender in its heart, but with fire in its future. The war dragged on. Years passed, like tides, each bringing new battles, new losses, new hopes. Cities changed hands, fleets were built and broken. Sicily became a graveyard of ambition, its soil stained with the blood of both empires. In 241 BCE, after over 2 decades of war, Rome delivered a final blow. At the Battle of the Agates Islands, Roman forces ambushed the Carthaginian fleet. During a supply run, many ships were sunk, others captured. It was a decisive, brutal victory. Carthage, exhausted and cornered, agreed to terms. Peace was signed. Sicily was handed to Rome. Heavy reparations were imposed. Carthaginian pride was wounded, but not shattered. The treaty marked the end of the First Punic War, but it did not mark the end of conflict. For Carthage, the loss was a lesson. It had underestimated Rome. It had trusted too much in tradition. It had believed for a moment that the sea alone would protect it. Now it knew better. The peace was uneasy. It was accepted not with resignation but with recalibration. Carthage turned inward, rebuilt, studied, and far to the west, in the silver-rich lands of Iberia, a new chapter was quietly beginning. A general was rising, a family was preparing. The First Punic War had ended, but the fires of the next would soon be lit. In the quiet that followed, the sea seemed still again. But beneath its surface, something stirred, a future forged not in peace, but in memory. Chapter 5: Mercenaries and Madness. Unpaid soldiers rise in fury, transforming from protectors into predators. After 23 years of war, Carthage stood quiet. Her harbours no longer echoed with the clash of naval battles. Her legions, once scattered across Sicily and the sea, had returned, but they did not come home to triumph. They came to silence, to delay, and to debt. Victory in the First Punic War had not brought peace. It had brought poverty. The war had drained the Carthaginian treasury. Grain fields were scorched. Trade had faltered. The cost of building ships, paying tributes and maintaining far-flung outposts had piled like sand on a drowning shore, and the soldiers, mercenaries drawn from Africa, Spain, Gaul and beyond, waited. They had spilled blood, or Carthage. They had fought on foreign shores, buried friends beneath strange stars, and carried the weight of an empire's ambition. And now, back on African soil, they waited for their wages. But Carthage hesitated. The state delayed payments, hoping to renegotiate. Leaders spoke of adjustments, reductions, promises to pay once the economy recovered. But hunger does not wait, neither does rage. What began as unease turned to tension. Mercenary camps outside the city grew restless. Words of disappointment turned to whispers of betrayal. Soldiers who had once protected Carthage now looked at its walls with suspicion. Anger spread, quiet and contagious. Then it snapped. A dispute with officials over pay sparked violence. One tent burned, then another. Weapons were drawn, not against Rome, not against invaders, but against Carthage itself. The city that had survived Roman fleets now faced a new storm, born not from foreign conquest, but from broken trust. And this time, the enemy wore no foreign badge. It wore the armor of yesterday's heroes. The mercenary war begins. Africa burns as Carthage faces not foreign invaders, but its own wrathful children. The war that followed was unlike anything Carthage had faced before. It was not fought for conquest or territory. It was born of betrayal, hunger, and fury. The soldiers who rose against Carthage were not strangers. They had once been comrades. Now they were the architects of chaos. Led by the Libyan soldier Spendius and the Campanian Mathos, the rebel army swelled quickly. Disparate groups, Mercenaries, oppressed laborers, local tribes, united under a single banner of vengeance. Their cry was not for glory, but for justice twisted by desperation. The war spread like fire. Towns that once paid tribute to Carthage turned their backs. Garrisons defected, grain stores were seized, trade routes were blocked, roads became ambushes, hills became fortresses. The countryside, once dotted with olive trees and vineyards, became a battlefield painted in ash. Carthage, caught off guard, scrambled to respond. Its army, already weakened by the recent war, lacked unity. Its generals disagreed, supplies dwindled. For the first time in memory, Carthage was fighting for survival, not against a mighty empire, but against its own reflection. The rebels showed no mercy. Carthaginian captives were tortured, loyal cities were razed, envoys were slaughtered. It was a war stripped of honor, where every act of violence was personal. Carthage sent out desperate calls for help. Few answered. Her allies, shaken by her weakness, stayed silent. Her enemies watched from across the sea, waiting for her to collapse. The city's leaders turned to the one man they hoped could reverse the tide, a man who had fought the Romans, a man unafraid of difficult wars. His name was Hamilcar Barca, and he was not coming to negotiate. Hamilcar's reckoning. A general returns to restore order, fighting a war of shadows and betrayals. Hamilcar Barca had returned from Sicily weary, but not defeated. He had seen the strength of Rome, the limits of Carthage, and the pain of war. Now he saw something worse, the disintegration of everything he had defended. The city entrusted him with command, and he accepted not as a hero, but as a surgeon. To cut deep, to remove rot, to save what was still alive. He did not march with fanfare. He moved with precision. Hamilcar knew these rebels. He had fought beside them. He knew their leaders, their habits, their weaknesses, and more importantly, he knew how to think like them, how to predict their rage, how to exploit their pride. His campaign began with quiet victories, small towns reclaimed, supply lines reopened, then ambushes, swift, brutal, surgical. He offered mercy, but only once. Those who refused met fire. But this was not a clean war. Spendius captured dozens of Carthaginian officers and executed them, slowly, publicly. In reply, Hamilcar responded in kind, not from cruelty, but to match the tempo of terror already set. At the Battle of the Soar, a brilliant maneuver allowed Hamilcar to trap thousands of rebels in a narrow valley. With supplies cut, escape blocked, and morale shattered, they surrendered. Carthage had its first true breath of hope, but the war was far from over. The rebels regrouped. They struck elsewhere. Betrayals erupted from within Carthage's own ranks. It became a war of sieges and starvation, not just of steel and sword. Every road was watched. Every night brought new fires. The land itself seemed exhausted, yet through it all Hamilcar pressed forward, measured, relentless, unmoved by horror. Because he was not just fighting to win, he was fighting to remind Carthage who she was. Lessons. In ashes, victory comes, but at a cost, the kind that buries trust and hardens hearts. In the end, Carthage prevailed. Hamilcar, through iron will and calculated fury, crushed the rebellion. Spendius was captured and executed. Marthos, too, was taken and put to death. The rebel forces, once so vast, were shattered. Town by town, city by city, order was restored. But victory did not feel like triumph. Carthage had not faced an enemy, it had faced itself. And though it survived, it emerged scarred. Tens of thousands were dead, farmlands were ruined, trade was disrupted, families were divided. The very people Carthage had once relied on, its soldiers, its workers, its allies, had turned against it. And in crushing the rebellion, Carthage had been forced to become something harder and colder. The city learned a terrible lesson. Loyalty, once broken, cannot be fully repaired. Trust, once burned, leaves only shadow. And fear, once awakened, does not sleep easily. Hamilcar left the war with no celebration. He did not seek parades. He asked for something else, command in Iberia. There, far from the ashes of Africa, he would begin again. Not just rebuilding Carthaginian power, but preparing for something larger, for something beyond revenge. Carthage had survived the mercenary war, but it would never forget it, and in the silence that followed, in the smoke rising from distant hills, a new resolve began to form. Quiet, sharp, unshakable, a city hardened. By betrayal, now turned its eyes outward, and beyond the sea, Rome watched. Chapter 6. The House of Barsus rises. After quelling chaos, Hamilcar turns to Spain, dreaming of redemption and strength. The fires of the mercenary war still smouldered when Hamilcar Barca turned his gaze west. The lands of Carthage had survived, but barely. Its treasury was broken, its confidence shaken. And though the rebellion had been crushed, the scars it left would take years to fade. Carthage could not afford to collapse again, not in spirit, not in strength. So Hamilcar moved, quietly, deliberately, toward a new horizon. To the west of the Mediterranean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, lay Iberia. A land rich in minerals, in warriors, in opportunity. For Carthage, it was a land far from Roman interference. For Hamilcar, it was something more, a second chance. Not just for the city he served, but for the name he bore. The House of Barcas, burned in the memories of civil war, would be reborn, not in the streets of Carthage, but in the valleys and mountains of Spain. Hamilcar understood what few others did. The next war with Rome was not a question of if, but when, and so he began to prepare. Not with threats, but with vision. Not with words, but with iron and stone, he led a small force into Iberia. Soldiers, engineers, advisors, and his own sons. Not in conquest, but in promise. Each step he took was a foundation. Each treaty signed, each village aided, each mine reopened. It was all part of a greater design. He did not speak of revenge, not openly. He spoke of renewal, of wealth to rebuild Carthage, of alliances to secure its frontiers, of a future shaped, not by Rome's hand, but by Carthaginian will. In the quiet hills of Iberia, the House of Barcas rose again, and history began to turn. Foundations in Iberia. Carthage begins anew in Iberia, mines, cities, and the quiet hum of ambition. The land Hamilcar chose to build upon was not empty. Iberia pulsed with its own life, tribes with deep roots, cities older than Carthage itself, and people hardened by stone and sun. But Hamilcar came not as a destroyer. He came with gold, with skill, and with patience. Carthage had long known of Iberia's riches, silver veins that glinted beneath the earth, forests filled with timber, fields that answered kindly to the plough. But Hamilcar saw more than wealth. He saw a future base, one that could fuel Carthage's rebirth, arm its defenses, and prepare for the days ahead. He moved carefully. He made alliances with local tribes through marriage, through trade, through shared purpose. He built cities, not monuments, but centers of function. Roads stretched between mines and markets. Ports were deepened to welcome ships. And watchtowers dotted the hills, quietly marking a growing presence. Hamilcar's settlements became more than outposts. They became symbols. Carthaginian coins began to circulate. Temples rose, not in place of local gods, but alongside them. Children in Iberian villages began to learn Punic words. Soldiers began to wear Carthaginian armor. The transformation was slow but deliberate. Hamilcar knew Rome was watching. He knew spies would whisper of expansion, of movement, of change, and he did not hide it. Because he wasn't building an empire of surprise, he was building one of certainty. He was saying, with every stone laid, every treaty signed, Carthage is not finished. And in the hum of forges and the clatter of pickaxes in the mines, a quiet momentum gathered. The kind of momentum history often overlooks until it cannot. A young Hannibal by the Ebro River, a child watches war become destiny, learning not from books but from scars. Among the mountains and rivers of Iberia, where new cities grew and alliances formed, a boy walked in the shadow of a general. His name was Hannibal, eldest son of Hamilcar, and though his legs were still short and his hands not yet hardened, his eyes saw everything. He watched his father meet with tribal leaders, sometimes laughing, sometimes yelling, but always in control. He watched soldiers drill, watched their discipline, watched the way they moved, not just with strength, but with belief. He saw men give their loyalty not out of fear, but out of respect. Hannibal did not learn history from scrolls. He learned it from scars. From the silence his father carried, from the weight in his voice when he spoke of Carthage, of betrayal, of the Romans. At night, when the fires burned low and the sky turned silver, Hannibal would sit near the elders. They spoke of Tyre, of Sicily, of gods who watched but did not interfere. They told stories of honor, of fate, of the silence before storms. And he listened. He rode with his father across Iberia, not as a prince, but as an observer. He saw cities being shaped. He saw mines running deep. He saw the joy of peace and the necessity of readiness. Hamilcar did not hide war from him. He taught him the weight of a sword, the length of a march, the fear in a soldier's breath before battle. But he also taught him patience, timing, that a knife is sharpest when it waits. By the time Hannibal was 9, he understood more than most men twice his age. He understood that empires rise not by chance, but by will. And he understood that his family was no longer just part of Carthage, it was shaping it. The oath. In a sacred moment, Hannibal vows to his father, Rome will never know peace from Carthage. One morning, when the air still carried the chill of dawn and mist hung low along the Ebro River, Hamilcar brought Hannibal to a small altar just beyond their camp. It was old, older than Carthage, perhaps older than Tyre. Worn by wind and worship, it stood beneath a grove of olive trees that bent as if in silent prayer. Hamilcar said little. He placed his hand on his son's shoulder and looked into his eyes, not with fire, but with stillness. In his gaze was the weight of wars, of memory, of expectation. There were no guards, no scribes, no audience, just a father and a future. There, before the silent stones, Hamilcar asked his son to make a vow. Not to gods, not to kings, but to him, to the memory of Carthage, to the suffering of its people, to the broken promises of peace. And Hannibal, young but unwavering, placed his hand upon the stone. He swore that for as long as he lived, he would be Rome's enemy. That peace would never rest between them. That Carthage would not forget. It was not a moment of anger. It was quiet, like the sea before a storm. History would remember this oath, but in that moment it was just a promise between two souls. One, hardened by war, the other shaped by it. As the sun rose over Iberia, casting gold across the river's surface, Hannibal turned away from the altar. Still a child, but no longer ordinary. He walked back to camp, and behind him the future followed. Chapter 7. Hannibal's March. A siege ignites the Second Punic War as Hannibal takes his first defiant step. In the golden haze of Iberian summer, the walls of Saguntum stood tall, quiet, unaware of the storm they were about to endure. Nestled just south of the Ebro River, the city was proud, loyal to Rome, distant from Carthage, and secure in its alliances, but its location was a thread in a much larger fabric, stretched tight by history and ambition. Hannibal, now commander of Carthage's armies in Iberia, had waited. He had watched the treaties with Rome, understood their limits, studied their weaknesses. And when the moment came, he did not hesitate. Saguntum was more than a city. It was a statement. Its presence below the Ebro with Roman backing was a challenge, not in words, but in proximity, in posture, in presence. Hannibal saw in it the same quiet arrogance that had marked the end of his father's war, a quiet threat veiled in diplomacy. So he marched on it. The siege was not sudden. It was slow, deliberate, each move calculated. Walls were surrounded, trade routes severed, supplies denied. Hannibal's engineers constructed rams and towers. His soldiers dug trenches beneath the scorching sun. Day by day, pressure mounted. Inside the city, defenders clung to hope. They sent word to Rome, pleading for help. But the Republic was cautious. It debated, argued, waited. And Hannibal waited too, but only until Saguntum's walls cracked. After 8 months, the city fell. Smoke rose above broken towers. Its people were taken. Its stones, once symbols of stability, now stood as ruins beneath Carthaginian feet. Rome had been warned. It had been given time, but it had failed to act. Hannibal had not. This was not merely an act of conquest. It was an invitation. The Second Punic War had begun. Not with legions, but with a lesson. And Hannibal had written it in flame. Crossing the Alps, elephants, frost and silence, Hannibal's legendary journey becomes the stuff of epic. If war was now certain, Hannibal would not wait for it to come to him. He would bring it, not by sea, not along well-trodden paths, but through the teeth of the world itself. The Alps, vast, cold, and unforgiving, rose between Carthage's Iberian forces and the heart of the Roman Republic. They were not a route. They were a warning, a wall of rock and snow, a place where no great army had ever marched. Hannibal chose them anyway. In late autumn of 218 BCE, he set his plan in motion. With nearly 90,000 soldiers, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants, he crossed the Ebro and headed north, cutting through hostile territory, facing ambushes, fording rivers swollen with ice. At the Rhone River, he clashed with Gauls. The crossing was perilous. Supplies floated on makeshift rafts, horses swam beside trembling men, and fear lingered like mist. But the worst lay ahead. The Alps waited, white, towering, and merciless as they climbed. The air grew thin. The sun disappeared. Frost bit at flesh. Horses slipped and fell into ravines. Soldiers lost fingers to frostbite. Some lost hope. Avalanches buried entire units. Storms howled through the passes. Paths crumbled beneath them. Still, Hannibal pushed forward. He walked beside his men, endured the same cold, slept in the same snow. He did not command from safety. He led from suffering. When they finally descended the far side, only half of his army remained. But they had done the unthinkable. They had crossed the Alps. Not just to reach Rome, but to show Rome that its walls, its legions, its republic, none of it was beyond reach. The frozen silence of the mountains echoed with a truth no general had ever uttered aloud. Rome was not untouchable, and Hannibal was coming. Arrival in Italy. Carthage's lion arrives on Roman soil, striking terror deep into the Republic's bones. The year was still young when Hannibal stepped onto the Italian plain. Tattered but unbroken, his army moved like a shadow stretching southward, cavalry at the edges, elephants at the center, dust rising behind them like the breath of something ancient. Rome had prepared for war, but not like this. They had expected Carthaginian ships to land in Sicily or Africa to rise in rebellion. They had not expected Hannibal, cold, determined, and already within their borders. He moved quickly, linking with Gallic tribes eager to resist Roman rule. Reinforcements joined him, scouts reported his strength, Roman messengers whispered his name. Panic stirred. The first clash came at the Battle of the Tixinus River, where Hannibal's cavalry overwhelmed Roman forces with terrifying speed. The next came at the Trebia in December. In the freezing waters of the river, Hannibal lured the Romans into a trap, ambushing them with a hidden force as they crossed the banks. Thousands perished. But it was only the beginning. Winter passed. Spring returned, and with it came Hannibal, sweeping south, gathering strength, and unraveling Rome's plans. At Lake Trasimene, he laid yet another trap. He concealed his army in the hills. When the Romans passed through the narrow valley, Hannibal struck. Fog blanketed the lake. Chaos erupted. Entire legions drowned or were slaughtered without ever drawing formation. It was one of the largest ambushes in history. Rome was no longer preparing for war, it was struggling to survive one. In Hannibal, the Republic had found not just an enemy, but a presence that defied expectation, logic, and fear, and he was only getting started. A war of shadows, Hannibal's presence changes everything, not just in battle, but in Roman memory. For the next 15 years, Hannibal remained in Italy, unconquered, undefeated, unrelenting. His army, though outnumbered, carved its name into every region it touched. From the mountains of the Apennines to the southern plains, his strategy reshaped the landscape, not in territory, but in psychology. He did not march on Rome directly. He did not need to. His victories were messages. At Cannae in 216 BCE, he delivered a blow so devastating that it would haunt Roman dreams for generations. Using a crescent formation, he enveloped the Roman legions, encircling them fully. The slaughter was total, nearly 50,000 Roman soldiers killed in a single day. No Roman defeat had ever come close. No battlefield had ever bled so much. But Hannibal did not sack Rome. He waited. He hoped Rome's allies would defect. Some did, but many remained loyal. Rome bled, but did not fall. Years passed, and Hannibal remained. He became a ghost in their fields, a rumor in their villages. Children feared him. Senators raged about him. Generals studied him, but few could match him. He was not just a general. He was a presence, and presence, when felt long enough, becomes myth. Even as his forces grew thin, even as Carthage sent fewer supplies, even as Rome slowly regained its breath, Hannibal held his ground. A war of shadows had begun, not fought in sieges or cities, but in willpower, memory, and fear. Rome would survive, but it would never forget, and Hannibal, he would never be ordinary again. Chapter 8. The Battle of Cannae. At Cannae, Hannibal prepares a maneuver the world will never forget. The summer of 216 BCE was hot in southern Italy. The fields around the village of Cannae shimmered in the haze. Crops bowed in silence under the weight of sun and dust. But that August it was not harvest the land would know. It was death. For months, Hannibal had lingered in Italy like a storm cloud that never broke. He had won battles, Ticinus, Trebia, Trasimene, each a wound in Rome's pride, each a test of its resolve. And yet the Republic still stood, stubborn and unbending, its legions regrouped, its allies, though shaken, mostly held. Now Rome had decided it was time to end the shadow that haunted them. The Senate sent 2 consuls with the largest army it had ever assembled, over 80,000 men, 2 leaders, 2 commands, 1 aim: destroy Hannibal. They found him at Cannae. Hannibal chose the ground himself, flat and open, a place where cavalry could run and dust could rise. The Aufidus River curved nearby, its slow waters whispering, around stones as if sensing what was to come. Hannibal watched the Romans from a distance. He counted their banners, he measured their hunger, and he smiled. Because what Rome did not know was that the battle they were marching toward was not a confrontation, it was a trap. Hannibal arranged his troops with care. In the center, he placed his weakest units, Gauls, Iberians, men who would bend but not break. Behind them, strong African infantry waited. On the flanks, cavalry stood ready, hidden in plain sight. He knew the Romans would push forward, too eager, too proud. He would let them. And then when they believed they were winning, When they surged inward toward his center, he would close the jaws. It was more than a tactic, it was art, and it would be remembered for all time. Encircled and erased, Roman forces are drawn in and then destroyed in a dance of precision and death. The morning of the battle broke quiet. Hannibal's army stood in formation, their backs to the wind. Dust clung to their tunics, sweat darkened their brows. But their eyes were steady. They had marched with him across mountains. They had fought in fog and frost, and now they would fight in flame. Rome's army stood larger, brighter, proud in its numbers. Rows upon rows of legionaries, shields gleaming, spears steady, banners waving like the breath of war itself. At their front stood Varro, one of the two consuls, brimming with confidence. He believed the day would be Rome's. The battle began with the Roman advance, predictable, powerful, direct. The center of Hannibal's line bent back under pressure, curving like a bowstring. To Roman eyes, it looked like weakness. Their lines pushed harder. Dust filled the air. Steel flashed in the sun, but the curve did not break. It absorbed, and then it snapped shut. Hannibal's African infantry, hidden in reserve, surged inward from the sides. At the same time, his cavalry, having routed the Roman horsemen on the wings, returned to the rear. Now, Rome's army, tens of thousands strong, was no longer pushing forward. It was surrounded, the circle tightened. From all directions, Hannibal's men closed in. The Roman soldiers, packed tightly in the center, could not move, they could not breathe. They could not swing their swords. They died. Hour after hour, the slaughter continued. There was no escape. The Roman formation collapsed into panic. But panic had no path. They were penned like animals and picked apart with mechanical precision. By nightfall, the field was silent. Of the 80,000 Roman soldiers who had begun the day, more than 50,000 were dead. Tens of thousands more were captured or wounded. The earth, once golden with wheat, was now red with blood. And Hannibal had done what no enemy had ever done before. He had broken Rome's army, not at the edges, but at its heart. A day of mourning. Rome weeps. Names vanish from ledgers. Families vanish from history. When word reached Rome, the city did not cry out. It fell silent. The names of the dead trickled in slowly, scribes whispering them into the halls of the Senate, mothers hearing nothing but wind where voices should be. Fathers who had once boasted of sons now sat in doorways, staring at the sky. The city's pulse slowed, the forum emptied. It was not just soldiers who had died, it was generations. Entire families were gone. Young men, future consuls, scholars, builders, and poets, erased in a single day. Streets that once echoed with laughter fell quiet. Houses shuttered their windows. Shops closed their doors. Rome did not fall, but something inside it cracked, and yet it did not surrender. The Senate, though shaken, stood tall. Orders were given. The gates were secured, defenses were strengthened, but there would be no panic, no plea. Not yet. They declared a national day of mourning, not for ceremony, but because there were too many funerals to hold. And still, Hannibal waited. He did not march on Rome. He rested his men. He sought allies in southern Italy. Some joined him, others hesitated. Rome, wounded, still held the loyalty of many. The city mourned. but it also remembered, and it prepared. Because if Hannibal had taught them fear, he had also taught them something else: how to survive it. The silence after victory. Even in triumph, Hannibal knows victory does not always bring surrender. As the sun rose the day after Cannae, the battlefield remained still. No trumpets sounded, no parades marched. The dead lay where they had fallen. Hannibal walked among them, not as a conqueror, but as a man who had seen too much. He had achieved the impossible. He had turned strategy into legend, but he had not broken Rome. He had hoped that such a defeat would force the Senate to negotiate. That fear would open the door that swords could not. But Rome did not beg. And in that silence, Hannibal began to understand. Victory was not always enough. He remained in Italy for years. He won more battles. He reshaped Roman policy. He became a phantom in their dreams, a shadow in their maps. But he could never strike the final blow because Rome had learned not how to win, but how to endure. The brilliance of Cannae would echo through time. Military academies, centuries later, would study its form, its curve, its closure. Generals would whisper of Hannibal's genius. His name would ride the wind across battlefields long after he was gone. But in that moment, on that blood-soaked plain, Hannibal saw the truth. Sometimes, even when the trap is perfect, the prey survives. And so he waited. The Lion of Carthage, in the heart of Italy, pacing behind Rome's walls. Unbeaten, but unanswered. Chapter 9. The Long War. The war stretches on, not in flames, but in endless embers smouldering across lands. After Cannae, after the cries had faded and the blood had dried beneath the Italian sun, the war did not end. It did not rest. It lingered, slow, burning, stretching on not in great battles, but in silence, in survival, in a heavy kind of waiting. This was no longer a war of lightning strikes or thunderous defeats. It had entered another form, drawn out, cold around the edges like a winter, that refuses to lift. Towns that had once traded freely now shuttered their gates at dusk. Roads grew overgrown, not from neglect, but from fear. Families traveled less, markets quieted. The rhythm of peace had been interrupted, replaced by something quieter, something darker. Hannibal remained in Italy, not as a conqueror in constant motion, but as a ghost, appearing in one valley, then vanishing into another. His army moved like smoke, never fully there, never fully gone. For years he wandered the Italian countryside. Cities that had once flown the Roman standard now trembled at his passing. Some defected, some resisted, most simply endured. This was the long war, measured not in battles won or territories claimed, but in the erosion of time itself. Hannibal lived off the land. Supplies were no longer guaranteed. Carthage, locked in its own troubles, could offer little more than promises. The once glorious Carthaginian army was still feared, still brilliant in execution, but it was no longer growing. It was surviving. Meanwhile, Rome did not collapse. Its walls stood. Its Senate met. Its people mourned, but they also remembered. Rome's greatest virtue was not speed nor even skill. It was something older, something quieter, stamina. And so year after year, war continued, not as a firestorm, but as smouldering coals that refused to die. This was not peace, but it was not destruction either. It was the space in between, and it would last for years. Rome adapts. Slowly, methodically, Rome changes, matching Hannibal's genius with patience. When Hannibal crossed the Alps, Rome was bold. When Cannae was lost, Rome was shaken. But after that, after the worst had happened, Rome began to change. Slowly, deliberately. The Republic had always favored quick resolutions. Its armies were built for decisive victories, its politics for bold strokes. But Hannibal had shown them something different, something harder, and they had listened. Out of the ruin of Cannae came a new strategy, one led by a man named Quintus Fabius Maximus. He did not chase Hannibal. He did not offer open battle. Instead, he followed, harassed, delayed. He was cautious to a fault, and many hated him for it. They mocked him as cunctator, the delayer. But Fabius understood what others did not. Hannibal's strength was in his speed, his unpredictability, his brilliance. The only way to beat him was not to meet him, but to wait him out. So Rome began to play a different game. Its armies were trained not for glory, but for endurance. Its roads were fortified, its allies reassured, no longer trying to reclaim everything. At once, Rome focused on the essential. Cities still loyal were reinforced. Those that wavered were punished, but not always destroyed. Rome now understood that holding Italy required more than force. It required memory, roots, promise. Fabius's strategy would spread like slow-growing moss, quiet, steady, unshakable. Other commanders came and went. Some defied Fabius' patience, rushing into battle and paying the price. Others learned. By 214 BCE, a generation of Roman generals had grown not under the shadow of victory, but under the shadow of Hannibal. They adapted, they observed, they no longer underestimated. Hannibal, for all his brilliance, now faced an enemy that had finally stopped trying to outsmart him and started trying to outlast him. And that made all the difference. Italy endures. Though cities fall and allies waver, the Roman heart holds fast. Italy was not simply a backdrop to this war, it was the war. From the northern lakes to the southern hills, the peninsula bore the weight of armies and ashes. Every river had carried blood. Every forest had held silence after screams. Villages became way stations for soldiers. Fields became graves. But somehow, life continued. After Cannae, Carthage hoped Italy would crumble, that Rome's allies would turn, that old grievances would split the Republic apart. At first, some cities did. Capua, the jewel of Campania, opened its gates to Hannibal. Tarentum followed. Dozens of smaller towns chose survival over loyalty. But Rome responded. Sometimes with kindness, sometimes with fire. Capua, when retaken, was stripped of power and punished harshly. Its leaders were executed, its people were scattered. Rome made it clear defection would not be forgotten. Yet Rome was not only punitive. Cities that stayed true were protected and praised. They received troops, coin, respect. The message was clear. Rome rewarded faith, but never forgave betrayal. This balance, though cruel, worked. By 212 BCE, fewer cities risked switching sides. Even those under Hannibal's shadow chose silence over rebellion. The war had shown them that Carthage might win battles, but Rome stayed. The land suffered. Farms were abandoned. Trade routes vanished. Families lived in constant fear. But Italy did not break. It adapted, it endured. The war in all its horror became routine. Farmers planted crops while scouts watched for smoke on the hills. Children grew up knowing the sound of marching feet. Life adjusted around the war, not in surrender, but in stubbornness. Rome's greatest ally was not just its legions, it was Italy itself. A new strategy. While Hannibal prowls the countryside, Rome plots a war of attrition. By 211 BCE, Rome had begun to think long-term. They saw now that Hannibal could not be removed from Italy with one stroke. But they also saw his weakness. He was isolated. Carthage had no foothold in central Italy. Its supply lines were thin. Hannibal's army relied on what it could take, not what it could receive. Rome's generals knew they could not expel him directly. So they looked elsewhere. They opened new fronts. In Iberia, Roman armies landed with the goal of cutting off Carthage's wealth at its source. They fought against Hasdrubal, Hannibal's brother, and began a slow push through the rugged Spanish hills. In Sicily, another Roman campaign eliminated Carthaginian presence entirely, securing the island and the grain it provided. Every campaign outside Italy served one purpose: to isolate Hannibal further. Rome also leaned into its greatest strength: production. Armies could be raised faster, ships could be built stronger, taxes flowed, roads stretched. Every year that passed, Rome grew more coordinated, and Carthage did not. It sent aid slowly, reluctantly. Internal politics muddied decisions. Hannibal wrote letters pleading for reinforcements, but only pieces arrived. Never enough. Rome no longer played to win quickly. It played to win always. Even as Hannibal moved through Apulia or camped near Tarentum, his influence shrank. The Romans let him roam, but starved his war. They built fortresses around cities he captured, isolating them. They harassed his supply wagons. They avoided the open fields he loved. The mighty lion of Carthage was now fenced in, not by walls but by time. In those quiet years, a truth began to emerge. Rome had accepted pain. It had accepted loss, but it would never accept defeat. And that was something Hannibal could not outmaneuver. Chapter 10: Scipio's Answer. Publius Cornelius, Scipio rises, young, untested, but touched by brilliance. The dust of Spain clung to the boots of a young man who had not yet earned the weight of legend. Publius Cornelius Scipio was not the name whispered in fear across empires, at least not yet. He was barely in his 20s when war carved a place for him. His father and uncle had both perished in Spain, struck down in the thickets of the Iberian campaigns. Rome, reeling, needed someone to take their place. And so the Senate turned to a boy who carried the name of a fallen line. The decision was bold, perhaps reckless. He was young, unproven, and still shaped more by dreams than scars. But there was something in him, an edge, a light, a calm fire that did not burn outward, but glowed within. Those who met him spoke not of his rank, but of his presence. He listened with stillness. He planned with care. And most of all, he understood people, not just soldiers, but enemies, allies, strangers. When Scipio arrived in Spain in 210 BCE, he inherited not just an army, but a failing front. Carthage had long dominated the Iberian Peninsula, using its rich mines, trade routes, and tribal alliances to fuel Hannibal's campaigns in Italy. Spain was Carthage's beating heart, and Scipio, young and untested, would be the surgeon with the blade. He did not act recklessly. Instead, he studied. He walked the camps, speaking to veterans. He observed terrain, tribal politics, and enemy movements with an eye sharpened by patience. Though barely out of adolescence, he saw what others missed. He realized that to defeat Carthage, one must not chase it blindly. One must remove its breath, its lifeblood, from the edges first. It began not with grand gestures, but with quiet, careful motion. The first of these steps would soon shake the whole of Iberia, breaking the Iberian backbone. Carthage loses its Spanish heartland as Scipio dismantles its legacy step by step. In the cool mist of early morning, Scipio launched a move no one expected. He targeted New Carthage, the jewel of Carthaginian Spain, a port city, fortified and proud, resting on the southeastern coast. It was not merely a military stronghold, it was a symbol, a gleaming echo of Carthage itself. Most commanders would have hesitated. Attacking such a city required siege equipment, long preparation, and favorable odds. Scipio had none of these. What he had was insight and timing. He knew the city's garrison was undermanned. He had studied the tides, the walls, the gates, even the routines of the guards. And most importantly, he had trust. His men believed in him. Not because of past victories, but because of his vision. With precision and silence, Scipio moved his forces. Under cover of darkness, they crossed rivers and hills. When they reached the city, the sun had not yet risen. The assault was sudden, controlled, and swift. Roman forces breached the city's defenses using the shallow lagoon Scipio had identified during low tide, an overlooked weakness. Panic set in. The garrison, caught between alarm and confusion, faltered. By midday, the city was his. It was more than a victory. It was a statement. Rome had taken New Carthage in one stroke. Carthage had not just lost a city, it had lost its pulse in Iberia. But Scipio did not stop. He did not bask in the triumph. With New Carthage secured, he reorganized. He distributed spoils with fairness. He freed hostages, earning the respect of local tribes. He trained his men not just as soldiers, but as instruments of discipline and morale. Battle by battle, Scipio unraveled Carthage's hold on Spain. He confronted Hasdrubal, the brother of Hannibal, and beat him at Bacula. He maneuvered through alliances and outmaneuvered ambushes. And though Carthaginian resistance remained, it grew thinner, more desperate. By 206 BCE, Carthage's grip had broken. The mines were lost. The armies scattered. The allies turned. Iberia no longer belonged to the heirs of Dido. It now bowed, quietly, steadily, to the rising will of Rome, turning the war's tide. With each victory, Scipio prepares to shift the war's gravity toward Africa. War, like water, flows where pressure moves it. For years, the conflict had lived in Italy, on Roman soil. Hannibal had haunted the countryside, turning victories into legends and Rome into a state of constant watchfulness. But now that tide began to shift. Scipio saw it first. Spain was not just a win, it was leverage. It severed Carthage from its greatest source of men, money, and material. With Iberia gone, Hannibal's breath grew shallow. His supply lines thinned. His support weakened. Scipio returned to Rome in 205 BCE, not as a boy, but as a man shaped by conquest. He was not only victorious, but visionary, and he came with a proposal: take the war to Africa. Bring the fight to Carthage's doorstep. Make Hannibal come home. The idea stirred debate. The Senate hesitated. Some feared it was too bold, too dangerous. Hannibal still roamed Italy, and Carthage was a fortress not to be trifled with, but Scipio's quiet confidence won hearts. He argued not with pride, but with precision. He showed maps. He recalled Spain. He promised alliances in Numidia, home of fierce cavalry and old grudges. And when permission was granted, he moved not with haste, but with calm intent. In Sicily, he gathered his forces, trained them, disciplined them. Months passed as he prepared not just for battle, but for transformation. He negotiated with Numidian leaders, first Syphax, then Massinissa, maneuvering politics as deftly as he had led soldiers. His vision was larger than tactics. It was about turning the very weight of the war. He was no longer a commander reacting to Hannibal's genius. He was a strategist redirecting the current of history. By the time his sails left the Sicilian coast, Scipio carried more than an army. He carried momentum. The Roman eagle was heading to Africa, preparing to meet Hannibal. Two destinies, one Roman, one Carthaginian, prepare to converge in dust and steel. In Carthage, news of Scipio's landing struck not like thunder, but like a slow, creeping shadow. For years the war had raged far away. Now it stood at the city's edge. Rome had come, not just with soldiers, but with a strategy sharp as any blade. Panic stirred in the Senate. Voices rose, accusations flared, and in the middle of it all stood one name, unchallenged, revered, feared: Hannibal. He had been fighting in Italy for over a decade, dancing between battles, defying odds, but now he was called home. The Carthaginian Senate knew that only one man could match Scipio. And so, like a tide called back by the moon, Hannibal returned. He crossed the sea, not with the same confidence that once brought him to Italy, but with the weight of a long war resting on his shoulders. He had given Carthage everything: youth, brilliance, unrelenting courage. And now he would give it one final stand. As he landed in Africa, Scipio already knew. Their paths were drawing inward. Two arcs, once moving apart, now rushed toward a single point. There was no hatred between them, only understanding. Scipio respected Hannibal, not just as an enemy, but as a teacher. Hannibal, in turn, sensed in Scipio not just a threat, but a successor to the art of war itself. They would meet at Zama, not as strangers, but as fated equals. Dust would rise. Shields would clash, and two destinies, one Roman, one Carthaginian, would settle the shape of the ancient world. Chapter 11. The Battle of Zama. Scipio and Hannibal, two minds forged in war, face one another for the first and last time. The dawn that rose over the plains of Zama carried a silence so profound it seemed even the birds dared not sing. The wind held its breath. Dust clung low to the earth, and across the flatlands of North Africa, two legacies prepared to meet, one carved in strategy, the other etched in survival. On one side stood Hannibal Barca, the shadow of Rome's worst nightmares. Years earlier, he had crossed the Alps with elephants and fury, threading through frozen mountains and enemy lines to strike the very heart of the Republic. His mind, cold and clear as steel, had danced circles around Rome's finest generals, For nearly 2 decades he haunted Italy, unbeaten, unmatched, and yet strangely distant from total victory. Now he returned, not to conquer, but to defend his homeland. Carthage was no longer distant thunder, it was trembling behind him. He carried its hopes in the creases of his armor and its fading strength in the weary eyes of his veterans. His army was not the same, worn by years, stitched from many lands, loyal but tired. Across the plain stood Publius Cornelius Scipio, a man younger in years but not in ambition. They called him Scipio Africanus, though the title had yet to be earned. He had watched Hannibal's terror unfold as a boy, had grown in the shadow of Roman defeat. But he had learned, patiently, cunningly, from Hannibal himself. And now they stood facing each other, not as strangers, but as mirrors, 2 minds shaped by war, yet moving in opposite directions, one defending the past, the other chasing the future. Their eyes never met before this day, but in every skirmish, in every maneuver, they had already spoken, across mountains, across oceans, across time, and at Zama they would speak once more. Not with words, but with the sound of shields locking, of cavalry galloping, of history trembling underfoot. The clash of armies. In North Africa, cavalry thunders, elephants charge, and empires hold their breath. The sun had fully risen by the time the earth began to rumble, not from thunder, but from hooves, from wheels, from elephants whose massive bodies shook the dust loose from stones. Hannibal's line stretched long and deep, 3 ranks strong, each layer a different story. The first was made of mercenaries, wild and reckless, paid not in loyalty but in gold. Behind them stood Carthaginian citizens, braver but fewer. And at the rear, the veterans of Italy, grey-haired, scarred but unyielding. These men had marched with Hannibal through every storm. If the day would be lost, it would not be because of them. Scipio's formation was disciplined, tight, Roman to its bone. His infantry stood in deep columns, each man silent, waiting. On his wings, Numidian cavalry, former enemies, now allies. Their horses were light, their spears sharp. Their loyalty, bought by fate and politics, would prove decisive. Then came the signal. Hannibal unleashed his war elephants. Dozens of beasts surged forward, eyes wide, tusks gleaming, fearsome as thunder, their trunks curled with rage. But Scipio had studied this. He opened lanes in his lines, gaps wide enough for the beasts to pass through, without scattering the legions. Trumpets blared, the Romans shouted, banged their shields, and let the noise disorient the beasts. Some elephants panicked and turned. They crashed into Hannibal's own lines. Others were picked off by javelins, by the precision of Roman skirmishers. Then came the infantry. The first ranks clashed in a cry of metal. The mercenaries fought hard but fractured quickly. The citizen soldiers held longer, disciplined and proud. But it was in the third line that the true war began. Hannibal's veterans met Scipio's best, sword against sword, shield against shield. The battlefield, once flat and open, now churned with bodies. Every inch was contested. Every step forward was paid for in blood. On the flanks, cavalry charged. The Numidians, once Hannibal's allies, now fought for Rome. They danced through the chaos, outmaneuvering Carthaginian riders. At the decisive moment, they wheeled and struck from behind, turning the balance. The moment hung in the air. A pause, a breath. Then As if the gods themselves had nodded, the tide turned. Hannibal's fall. For the first time, Hannibal's genius meets defeat, not in failure, but in finality. Hannibal fought not as a general above the field, but within it, moving among his men, calling out commands, steadying the line with his presence alone. There was no panic in him, only precision, no dread, only determination. But even he could see the pattern unfolding. The Roman formation, once static, now pushed like a tide. His mercenaries were gone, his cavalry broken. Even his veterans, weary and surrounded, began to bend under pressure. Scipio had turned his own tactics against him, the layered formation, the use of terrain, the waiting, not for victory, but for Hannibal to run out of surprises. Still, Hannibal did not flee. He had spent his life making Rome tremble. If he would fall with clarity, with his soldiers, with the name Barca still spoken in awe. The final moments came not with spectacle, but with the slow crumbling of resistance. One flank collapsed, then the center. The Carthaginian line, once mighty and complex, began to fold inward, like a fabric unthreaded. Hannibal withdrew only when the field was no longer a battle, but a slaughter. He was not captured. He would live on for years, in exile, in memory, in legend. But the general who had shaken empires was now mortal, defeated not by failure, but by time, by change, by a younger mirror of himself. Scipio did not celebrate with cruelty. He did not desecrate the fallen. He had admired Hannibal since boyhood. To defeat him was not just a triumph, it was a burden, for now he knew even legends break. The war ends with a whisper. Rome triumphs, Carthage bends, and silence falls over Zama. The field after battle is not loud, it is quiet. A silence that wraps around everything, like a shroud. The bodies do not move, the weapons lie still. And even the wind seems to pause. At Zama, silence followed victory. Scipio stood among the ruins, not of a city, but of a chapter. In history, he had won, Rome had won. But there was no joy in it, only a solemn understanding. Carthage would no longer threaten. The war was over, but so too was something ancient. A rivalry that had defined a generation had now ended, not in a blaze of glory, but in the stillness of defeat. In the days that followed, treaties were signed. Carthage, stripped of its power, would remain, but only as a shadow of its former self. No more war elephants, no more armies without Roman permission, no more dreams of empire. Scipio returned to Rome not just as a general, but as a symbol. He had conquered Hannibal. He had conquered fear. The people gave him the name Africanus, not as a title of vanity, but of finality. The man who had broken Carthage. But even he knew, peace is never forever. Somewhere beyond the horizon, new storms would gather. For now, though, the winds were calm, and over Zama, the earth slept. Chapter 12. The Hollow Peace. Carthage is left with trade, but without an army. Its sword snapped, its voice hushed. The dust had barely settled over the plains of Zama when the future of Carthage was sealed, not in fire, not in ruins, but in silence. A treaty was drawn, not with mercy, but with precision. Rome, now standing taller than ever, dictated the terms. Carthage would live, but only as a shell of its former self. The punishment was not immediate destruction. It was something colder, more methodical. The loss of warships, the outlawing of armies, the disbanding of elephants. Carthage, once a titan of the Mediterranean, was now forbidden to raise arms without Rome's permission. Even its alliances required approval. Its pride was not just wounded, it was dismantled. The mighty navy that once dominated sea routes was scuttled. Hundreds of ships, some with hulls that had touched every corner of the western Mediterranean, were burned in front of the city's eyes. The flames licked at the water as Carthaginians watched quietly, mourning not only the vessels, but the dignity that went with them. And so, Carthage returned to its port, not as a guardian of empire, but as a vessel for tribute. It was to pay Rome heavy reparations over 50 years, 50 long, bitter years of gold flowing outward. For many, it felt like a death, not one with smoke and screaming, but a death by silence, a slow suffocation of power. The streets, once filled with the rhythm of marching soldiers, now echoed only with footsteps of merchants. The Great Council, once crowded with generals and admirals, now debated prices and contracts. The city's voice, once defiant, had grown still. Carthage would not speak of war again, not because it chose peace, but because it had been denied the tools to choose anything else. Yet beneath the quiet surface, the heartbeat remained. Weak, but steady, a merchant city reborn. The people adapt, rebuild, and return to what they've always known: commerce and resilience. The soul of Carthage had never been born from war alone. Long before the elephants and swords, long before the legions and treaties, Carthage was a city of trade, a place of sales and scales, of salt and silver, of careful deals struck beneath sun-warmed stone. Now, without its weapons, it returned to that root. At first, there was sorrow. There always is when greatness fades. But the Carthaginians were not a people made of despair. They were, above all, survivors, descendants of Phoenician sailors who had crossed wide seas and carved cities. From dust, trade was not just their livelihood, it was their inheritance. The city turned its face back to the harbor. Ships were rebuilt, not for war but for goods. Caravans arrived from the interior, bearing ivory, spices, papyrus, and gold. Artisans worked in the alleys, crafting dyes, glass, textiles. Markets filled, bazaars hummed, and slowly, like vines, reclaiming broken stone, life returned. Families who had once lost sons to Roman spears now sent them to learn accountancy and commerce. Schools of navigation reopened. Languages flourished: Punic, Berber, Greek, Latin, spoken across stalls and porticos. Trade routes bloomed again, not with conquest, but with conversation. Carthage rebuilt, not as an empire, but as a network. It wove itself into the fabric of the Mediterranean, not with blades, but with silk. The city's docks thrived, its warehouses filled, its coins, once stamped with war elephants, now bore symbols of wheat, grapes, and the open sea. There was pain, of course, pain that lingered in every veteran's eyes, in every stone from a collapsed wall. But Carthage did what it had always done. It endured, it adapted, it changed without forgetting. The merchant city was reborn, not with fanfare, not with celebration, but with quiet resilience, prosperity without power. Ironically, Carthage thrives, again too visibly, too quickly for Roman comfort. The irony was bitter. What Rome had sought to extinguish, it had instead unleashed in another form. Carthage, shackled from war, bloomed in peace. The trade restrictions that should have stifled it were instead outmaneuvered. The payments demanded by Rome were met without struggle. Prosperity returned not in centuries, but in decades. By the time 2 generations had passed, Carthage looked alive again. Its streets were paved, its harbour expanded, its markets brimming. The reparations had not drained it, they had refined it, made it sharper, smarter, focused. And that made Rome uneasy. From across the sea, senators in white togas watched the city they had. And what they saw was not ruin, but rebirth. Carthaginian merchants were now seen in Alexandria, in Massalia, even in Rome itself. Carthaginian products, oils, wine, purple cloth, once again rivaled Roman goods. Whispers began. Some spoke of betrayal, of a second rising. Others simply feared the embarrassment. The enemy they had beaten was now outshining them in trade. Rome had destroyed Carthage's army, but had overlooked its engine, and Scipio Africanus, once the hero of Zama, had warned them. He had said, "I fear Carthage will rise again if we do not finish what we started." His words, at first ignored, now rang louder in senatorial halls. But what made Carthage dangerous wasn't ambition, it was competence. They had found power again, not in swords, but in influence, in diplomacy, in gold, in the sheer efficiency of a city built not on dreams, but on balance sheets. To the outside world, Carthage looked peaceful, polished, but to Rome it looked like a lesson they hadn't finished teaching. Peace had been imposed, but prosperity that had been earned, and that was perhaps the most dangerous victory of all, the watchful eye of Rome. As the city shines once more, Rome watches and remembers. From the Palatine Hill, senators gazed across the sea and felt unease. Not because of armies or alliances, but because Carthage dared to shine. In public, they praised peace. In private, they studied ledgers, shipments, grain prices, and harbour records. They sent envoys not as friends but as observers. These men walked the polished streets of Carthage and returned with troubling reports, new ships, thriving schools, foreign envoys welcomed with gifts. A city acting not defeated, but dignified. To the Roman mind, peace was only safe when it came with silence. But Carthage's peace had grown too loud. Old veterans, men who had fought Hannibal, who had watched elephants sweep through Roman fields, now sat in the Senate. Their memories were not soothed by treaties. They still saw fire in the Carthaginian name. And younger senators, raised on the tales of Cannae and Trebia, grew restless at the idea that this ancient rival was once again respected across the sea. Cato the Elder, stern, severe, unshakable, became their voice. He ended every speech, no matter the topic, with the same words, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. It was not yet policy, but it was a seed planted in fear, watered by suspicion, fed by pride. Carthage, for its part, kept to the treaty. No armies were raised, no threats were made. Its strength came from order, not defiance. And yet, Rome watched. Not because Carthage had broken peace, but because it had made peace look powerful, and in time that would be enough. The silence over Zama had faded, but a quieter tension had taken its place. One day, that silence would break again. But for now, Carthage stood, prosperous, peaceful, and watched. Chapter 13. Cato's Cry. Cato the Elder sees Carthage not as a city, but as a threat, and he repeats his cry to the Senate. There are some echoes that never fade, sounds that linger beyond the moment, pressed into memory like a footprint in stone. For Rome, one such echo belonged to an old man with a stern face and sharper words, Cato the Elder. He was not young when Carthage fell silent after Zama. In fact, Cato had already lived a life of war and service, hard and disciplined, shaped by the old virtues of the Republic. He had seen Carthage's armies, and more than that, he had seen what fear could do to Rome. And he never forgot. To Cato, Carthage was not a defeated city. It was a sleeping wolf. Not because it barked, but because it could one day bare its teeth again. While others in the Senate looked across the sea and saw markets, trade ships, and quiet plazas, Cato saw something else entirely. He saw a wound unhealed, a rival unbroken, a danger unspoken. And so he began his ritual. No matter the topic, grain, prices, road repairs, military appointments, Cato ended every speech with the same cold phrase, Delenda est Carthago. Carthage must be destroyed. It was not shouted, not argued. It was stated like a law of nature, like gravity. And at first many rolled their eyes. It was an old man's obsession, they thought, a relic from a war Rome had already won. But repetition has its power. Words, when spoken often enough, begin to shape belief. And slowly, like water dripping on stone, Cato's echo began to carve its mark. He visited Carthage himself once, late in life. He walked its wide street, saw its docks brimming with life, its markets full of trade. And rather than find peace in that prosperity, he found proof. To him, a thriving Carthage was not a sign of recovery. It was a warning. A city that had once brought Rome to its knees should not shine, not even in peace. The politics of fear. Rome begins to believe its own myth, that Carthage must fall, not because it threatens, but because it dares to live. Cato's cry did not spread by conquest, it spread by suggestion. Rome was a city that listened to its fears. It had once known what it was like to lose battles on its own soil, to see its armies shattered, to feel Hannibal's breath just miles from its gates. The scars of that fear had never fully healed. So when Cato spoke, those memories stirred. Rome had become stronger since Zama. It had grown richer, larger, more powerful than ever before. But power often brings something else with it, a need for control. And Carthage, even in silence, felt like something Rome could not fully control. Year after year, reports came in. Carthage was still paying its debts, still obeying the treaty, still disarmed, still cooperative, and yet it thrived. It attracted wealth, ideas, foreign guests. It stood tall, even as it remained politically humble. For many in the Senate, this resilience was more disturbing than defiance. What unsettled Rome was not Carthage's sword, but its survival. A defeated enemy was supposed to vanish, to crumble. But Carthage had found a way to grow without growing bold. It stood like a mirror to Rome's own ambitions, a reflection of what power could be without legions and conquest. And mirrors, as always, make people uneasy. So senators began to murmur. What if, they asked, what if Carthage rebuilds in secret? What if one day they rise again? Should we wait for that day? Or should we act while they are still weak? Fear was easier to sell than facts. And slowly the myth grew, not of a current threat, but of an inevitable one, a myth that said, if Carthage lives, Rome can never rest. A manufactured enemy, tensions are stirred, provocations made. War is not provoked by Carthage, but by Rome. The fire that would consume Carthage did not come from a spark within its walls. It was lit across the sea, carefully, deliberately, by Roman hands. Rome began by prodding small infractions, political games, demands that grew more aggressive. Carthage, ever cautious, responded with restraint. They had no army to strike back, no allies to defend them. They relied on patience, hoping obedience would protect them. But Rome was not looking for justice. It was looking for justification. A conflict soon emerged between Carthage and Numidia, a neighboring kingdom now favored by Rome. The Numidians, under King Massinissa, made repeated incursions into Carthaginian lands. They stole cattle, took towns, crossed borders. Carthage appealed to Rome for arbitration. Rome looked away. Left with no support and pushed to the brink, Carthage did something desperate. They defended themselves. They fought back. That was all Rome needed. The Senate declared this an act of war, not against Numidia, but against Rome. Never mind that Carthage had acted in self-defense. Never mind that they had followed the treaty for decades. Rome claimed that by taking up arms, Carthage had broken the pact. And now the punishment would not be a fine. It would be fire. But the enemy was not Carthage. It was the image of Carthage that Rome had built. A version shaped by Cato's words, by political ambition, by the hunger to eliminate uncertainty. Rome had written the story in advance. Now it would write the ending. Delenda est Carthago. The final decision is made. Carthage must be destroyed. Not tomorrow, now. The Senate voted. Not with hesitation, not with grief, but with the cold efficiency of a machine. The decision was final. Carthage would not be punished. Carthage would be erased. In 149 BCE, Roman legions crossed the sea. The city that had once terrified them was now their target, not as a rival, but as an idea that must be buried. When the Carthaginians heard, they did not march to war. They sent envoys, they pleaded, they offered complete surrender. They offered hostages, weapons, even control of their city. Rome accepted and then demanded more. "Leave your city," Rome said. "We will burn it, and you may rebuild elsewhere, far from the sea." It was a demand too cruel to meet. Carthage was not just stone and timber, it was memory, it was roots, it was identity. To abandon it was to abandon themselves. So they refused, and Rome got what it wanted. A final war. This time there would be no Hannibal, no elephants, no grand battles, only a siege, slow, brutal. 3 years passed. Carthage held as long as it could. Its people fought not as warriors, but as citizens defending a soul. They melted down statues to make weapons. They turned rooftops into barricades. the city became a walled heartbeat, pulsing against time. In 146 BCE, the walls were breached. Roman soldiers poured in, and Carthage, ancient, defiant, beautiful, was unmade. Buildings were leveled, temples burned, streets ran with smoke and silence. Survivors were taken as slaves, and the rest were buried with the city. Rome did not leave a rival behind. It left ashes. Cato was long gone by then, but his cry had become prophecy. Chapter 14. The Last War. Rome lands in Africa again, but this time not for battle, for annihilation. It was not the first time Rome crossed the sea to Africa, but this time it came without terms, without patience, without any intention of peace. In 149 BCE, Roman ships dotted the blue horizon once more. Their sails, white and wide, moved like the teeth of a great predator, silent, steady, and closing in. But unlike the last time, there would be no meeting of generals. No bargaining, no treaties written in Latin and hope. Rome had already decided. Carthage would not be beaten. It would be erased. The orders were clear. Carthage was not to be tamed or taxed. It was to be destroyed, stone by stone, wall by wall, voice by voice. 3 legions landed near the city's coast. Soldiers, many of whom had been raised on stories of Hannibal and Cannae, now stood ready to write the ending their fathers never finished. Among them was Scipio Aemilianus, the grandson by adoption of Scipio Africanus, the man who had once spared Carthage. But this Scipio had not come to spare. The Romans began to encircle the city. Trenches were dug, forts erected, a ring of siege. Engines slowly took shape like jaws around the city's throat. Every port was blocked, every path inland watched. The siege did not begin with fire. It began with silence, the kind of silence that comes before a long, cold death. Inside Carthage, the people did not beg. They remembered the terms Rome had given: surrender the city and be allowed to live elsewhere. But even that offer had been a lie. Carthage knew there would be no mercy, no second chance. So they chose to fight, not as an empire, but as a city. Not with legions, but with citizens. Carpenters took up spears. Merchants built barricades. Women carried water to the walls. Children gathered stones. And as Rome dug deeper, Carthage stood taller, waiting for the storm it already knew had begun. Starving the city, supplies are cut, walls crumble, and Carthage is slowly strangled. As weeks turned to months, Carthage became a city under siege in the truest sense. The gates were closed, the sea blocked, and every road turned to dust and watchmen. The sky above was open, but even that felt like a cage. The Romans choked the city methodically. Grain no longer arrived. Water grew scarce. Salt tainted what was left. The gardens within the walls withered, and livestock disappeared. People rationed dates, boiled leather, chewed dried roots. Hunger became a daily prayer, spoken not aloud, but in the hollow eyes of those waiting for nothing and enduring everything. The walls, thick and high, held strong at first. They had protected Carthage for generations, but even stone tires, when struck, too long. Roman battering rams worked day and night. Each thud against the walls sounded like a heartbeat slowing. Arrows flew overhead, Fires were set, watchtowers collapsed. Inside, Carthaginians repaired what they could. They filled breaches with rubble. They fought back with slings, boiling oil, and desperation. Every alley became a fortress, every home a battlefield waiting to be named. Disease crept in through the cracks left by hunger. Corpses were stacked. In corners, the smell of smoke blended with sickness. And yet, the city held. Rome, surprised by the resilience, tightened its grip. A wall around the walls was built, a circumvallation of siege that made escape impossible and surrender pointless. Carthage had become not just a city under siege, it had become a prison under fire. And still the people endured. They had nothing left but stone. And even that was beginning to bleed. The fall of Bursa. The last defenders retreat to the hilltop citadel, holding out until even the fires fade. Eventually, the outer walls gave way. The breach was slow, but it came. Roman soldiers poured into the lower districts, streets they did not know, corners filled with traps and resistance. Carthage did not surrender its neighborhoods easily. They were not lines on a map, they were memories. Each step Rome took forward was paid for in screams and smoke. Block by block, the Romans fought their way inward. The city was not conquered in a day. It was dismembered inch by inch, roof by roof, doorway by doorway. And when there was nothing left to defend but the heart of the city, the survivors gathered on Bursa Hill. Bursa, once the sacred citadel, home to temples and archives, now became the last stand. From its heights one could still see the sea. But it no longer offered escape, only the reflection of fire in the harbor. The sun rose each day not to bring light, but to reveal what had been lost. The defenders of Bursa were not soldiers. They were the remnants of Carthage, priests, mothers, elders, children, a few warriors with broken swords. And yet they did not run. They fortified the hill as best they could. Walls were raised with furniture, debris, anything that could slow the enemy. Sacred scrolls were hidden. Statues turned into barricades. The last firewood burned not for warmth, but to heat oil for defense. The Romans surrounded the hill and waited, and then they climbed. The assault on Bursa was the final climb in a long and tragic war. Roman soldiers scaled the hill in waves. The defenders met them not with organized ranks, but with whatever they had left: stones, sticks, fire. House to house they fought. One ancient historian would later write that for 6 full days, the fighting in Bursa did not pause. No hour passed without the clang of metal or the scream of loss. Even the Romans began to wonder, not if they would win, but if anything would be left to conquer. When the last Carthaginian fell, it was not to surrender, but to silence. The end of a world. Carthage burns, its temples collapse. Salt is sown, memory becomes ash. The fires started slowly. First in the houses looted for grain, then in the temples struck by Roman torches. But once the city caught flame, it did not stop. Stone cracked in the heat, roofs caved in, statues melted into faceless lumps. The library of Carthage, once said to rival the greatest in the ancient world, vanished in smoke. Streets where trade once danced with song now curled into blackened ruins. Markets, mosaics, fountains, all turned to ash. Scipio Aemilianus stood amidst the ruin, watching the city burn. He is said to have wept, not for victory, but for the world that had ended. He quoted Homer speaking of Troy and realized that every empire, no matter how mighty, ends in the same sound: silence. The survivors were few. Some were sold into slavery, others vanished into history. What remained was rubble. But Rome was not done. To ensure no city would rise again from this place, Roman officials ordered something final. Salt was sown into the earth, a gesture as symbolic as it was cruel. It would not kill the soil forever, but it made a statement: nothing must grow here. Not a weed, not a whisper. And so, Carthage, once the queen of the Western Sea, the rival of Rome, the pride of Phoenician heritage, ceased to exist. No tomb was built, no monument raised, only a shadow was left, cast by flame, and that shadow stretched through time. For centuries, Rome would tell itself it had saved the world by destroying Carthage. But deep down, some would always wonder, what world had they truly ended? Chapter 15. The Ghost Empire. Centuries pass, but Carthage does not sleep quietly. Its ghosts linger in stone and wind. Long after the fires dimmed and the ash cooled, Carthage remained, not in power, not in voice, but in presence. The city, though shattered, never truly disappeared. Its bones, carved into columns, courtyards, and broken ports, lay beneath layers of time. And though the world moved forward, something ancient continued to breathe beneath the dust. Centuries passed. Empires shifted, kings were crowned, then forgotten. But in North Africa, near the glittering coast, the ruins of Carthage whispered to the wind. Stones still held the warmth of 1,000 sunsets. Alleyways, once alive with trade and language, now slept under silence, but not emptiness. Each wall, each step, each shattered threshold held echoes of a people who had once dared to rival the greatest city in the world. Waves lapped gently against the remains of old harbours. Olive trees grew where villas had once stood. Grass pressed up through cracks in old mosaic tiles, tiles that had once lined the halls of merchants, sailors, and philosophers. And in the quietest hours of dawn, the light caught those ruins in a way that made them shimmer, not just with beauty, but with memory. Carthage was no longer a city, it was a feeling, a shadow cast by time. It haunted not with fear, but with grace, reminding all who walked among its stones that power can fall, but presence lingers, and that sometimes the ruins speak louder than the empire ever did. Legends. In Latin, Roman writers recall Carthage, sometimes in scorn, sometimes in secret awe. Rome, having crushed Carthage, could not quite let it go. The ashes were real, but the idea of Carthage remained fixed in Roman minds. It appeared in their writings, their plays, their histories, not as a friend, not even as a rival, but as something stranger, a warning, a reflection, a ghost too big to forget. Cato's cry, Delenda est Carthago, was remembered long after the city fell, not just as policy, but as prophecy. Cicero, Virgil, Sallust, Livy all wrote of Carthage. Sometimes they mocked it, describing it as decadent, proud, foolish. Other times they spoke with grudging admiration, unable to deny the brilliance that had once stood across the sea. In the Aeneid, Virgil imagined Queen Dido, founder of Carthage, as both noble and tragic. Her love for the Trojan hero Aeneas and her death by heartbreak were woven into the very myth of Rome's origin. A strange irony that Rome's greatest poet would immortalize the queen of its greatest enemy. And yet that's what Carthage had become, a mirror for Roman identity. The city that Rome had destroyed also helped define it. Carthage reminded Rome of what it had nearly lost, what it had feared, and what it had become to survive. Even as Latin spread across the world, it carried with it the name of Carthage, written in the margins of epic poems, tucked between lines of political speeches, etched into stone as warnings. The empire that fell became a legend Rome could not silence. Forgotten, but not lost. Though buried, Carthaginian culture survives in trade routes, ideas, and ruins. Carthage had been erased from maps, but not from memory. It had been stripped of life, but not of influence. Its language, the soft consonants of Punic, faded from daily speech. Its temples, once ringing with prayers to Baal and Tanit, fell to ruin. But ideas, like seeds in wind, found ways to travel. The Carthaginians had been traders above all, and trade leaves trails that cannot be buried. Across the Mediterranean, old Punic routes remained alive, used by Roman merchants, then Byzantine sailors, and later Arab navigators. The knowledge of ports, tides, and wind that had once carried Carthaginian fleets now served others. But the maps, though updated, still traced old Carthaginian paths. Their technology, especially in shipbuilding and agriculture, was quietly adopted. Their methods for storing grain, constructing harbours, organizing urban spaces, these were not praised, but they were copied. Efficiency does not need credit to survive. In Tunisia, where Carthage once stood, stories lingered in the soil. Some locals still named hills in memory of old battles. Farmers tilled fields once cultivated by Phoenician hands. And children played in courtyards paved with Carthaginian tiles, unaware of the empire beneath their feet. Archaeologists centuries later would uncover urns, amphorae, jewelry, coins, silent objects. Yet each one hummed with the quiet insistence that Carthage had not vanished. It had simply shifted from city to story, from presence to pattern. You could erase a people from power, but you could not erase their touch. Carthage remained, not in war, but in whispers. When empires become echoes, Carthage joins Troy, Babylon, and Atlantis as empires swallowed by time, but not by silence. Every empire believes it will last. But time is a patient sculptor, and even the strongest stone can be worn smooth by centuries. Carthage, once the merchant queen of the sea, joined the long line of lost empires, sitting beside the shattered towers of Troy, the hanging gardens of Babylon, and the myth of Atlantis. Not because it was imaginary, but because its memory blurred into something larger than fact. It became a symbol. Troy had burned in a night of rage. Babylon crumbled under the weight of its own beauty. Atlantis, if it existed at all, was said to have drowned beneath its ambition. And Carthage? Carthage was silenced by fear, by another empire's need to control the story. But in the end, all these cities, whether destroyed by war, water, or time, continued to speak. Not in power, not in politics, but in echoes. They spoke in ruins, in myths, in the way they made us wonder, how can something so vast simply vanish? History, it turns out, is not just about what survives. It's about what refuses to be forgotten. Carthage was destroyed, yes, but it was also remembered. And in that memory it lives, a whisper carried by stone, a shadow in Roman verse, a breath between waves. And so the ghost empire walks on, not to haunt, but to remind that even ashes, when held long enough, begin to glow. Chapter 16. Rome rebuilds Carthage. Under Julius Caesar, Carthage rises again, not in defiance, but as a Roman dream. There are cities that live, cities that die, and cities that return. Carthage was the third. For nearly a century, it had been dust and shadow. Rome had wiped it from the earth in fire and salt, leaving only scorched stones and hollow memories. The land where it stood remained silent for generations. Even animals, it was said, hesitated to pass through the ruins. The wind blew across charred foundations, whispering songs in a language no longer spoken. Travelers passed by in silence, unwilling to disturb a place so steeped in death. But memory is strange. What is once feared can, in time, become sacred, and to Julius Caesar, Carthage was not a grave. It was a vision waiting to return. Caesar stood above the ruins, staring across the sea, imagining what could be. He had conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, stared down the Senate itself. But here, in the dust of a former rival, he saw something different. He saw potential, power in stillness, strength in rebirth. He proposed that Carthage be rebuilt, not as a warning, but as a jewel of the Roman world, not a rebuke to its past, but a tribute to Roman greatness. In 44 BCE, the plan was announced, a Roman colony on the old site of Carthage. It would be named Colonia Julia Carthago. He would never live to see it. The Ides of March came quickly, and Caesar's life ended in blood beneath the Senate's gaze. But some dreams survive even their dreamers. Augustan grandeur. Temples, roads, and forums blanket the ruins. Rome clothes Carthage in imperial stone. It was Augustus, Caesar's heir, who brought the plan to life. With the civil wars behind him and empire now in his hands, Augustus looked to the future. Rome was expanding, and Africa, rich, fertile, strategic, needed a capital worthy of its promise. And so, brick by brick, the second Carthage began. This was not a quiet restoration. It was a declaration. Roman engineers poured into the region. They traced wide roads across hills once scarred by battle. Aqueducts climbed across valleys. Public baths gleamed with polished marble. Markets boomed. The new city, unlike its predecessor, was designed in clean symmetry. Straight avenues, elegant courtyards, grand plazas. It was a vision of order. The hill of Byrsa, once the final stand of the doomed Carthaginians, was crowned not by fire, but by temples. The gods of Rome, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, now stood where Tanit and Baal once watched over their people, where ancient defenders once hurled stones at Roman legions, fountains now bubbled and children played, amphitheaters rang with the cheers of thousands, gladiators clashed beneath the African sun, statues of emperors were raised across the forum, gazing down with imperial pride. The city, reborn, glittered with Roman elegance, but even as marble covered the wounds of war, the land beneath remembered. A prosperous province. The city thrives under empire, rich and multicultural, a jewel in Africa's crown. In time, the new Carthage did more than survive, it thrived. Rome had clothed it in grandeur, but it was the people who made it breathe. Traders from the east arrived by ship, docking at the curved harbours that mirrored the old Phoenician designs. Berber farmers came from inland, bringing figs, olives, and wheat. Greek artisans set up workshops in the alleyways. Latin echoed through the forums, but so did Phoenician phrases, faint but persistent. The province of Africa Proconsularis grew wealthy. Carthage became its beating heart. Its grain fed the empire. Its goods filled Roman markets. Its leaders dined with senators, and its scholars debated in temples and academies. Life in Roman Carthage was a tapestry of cultures. Markets overflowed with spices, dyed cloth, incense, silver. Ships came and went, some from Spain, others from Syria. The scent of bread and olive oil drifted through the streets. The city pulsed with rhythm, with layers of identity. Even faith evolved here. Carthage became one of the first major centers of early Christianity. The words of Tertullian and Cyprian, both sons of this land, began to spread through Roman churches. Their thoughts, passionate, fierce, poetic, were shaped not in Rome, but here, in Africa. Carthage was no longer just a Roman city. It was something more, a mosaic of old and new. A city built on layers, each one whispering its own truth, and through it all, wealth poured in. Culture blossomed, peace held. The ghost of the old empire drifted quietly, never fully gone, but content to watch. Beneath the pavement, the past. Even as Rome celebrates, the dust of Punic walls lies just beneath the surface. But beneath every polished stone, beneath every Roman column and villa, the past stirred. Builders uncovered strange objects, old stones etched with unfamiliar letters, broken statues of gods with horns and half-moon crowns. Deep beneath the new bathhouses and forums, the remains of Punic streets still ran, sometimes perfectly preserved, as though waiting to be found. The people of Carthage lived above a world they didn't always understand. Some were curious, others were uneasy. The ruins didn't speak, but they didn't sleep either. They were patient. Children digging in gardens sometimes found coins older than Rome's Republic. Soldiers posted to the city reported dreams of voices in languages they did not know. Farmers claimed their ploughs caught on ancient walls. The city had been reborn, but it had not forgotten. Each new building was laid over old foundations, each monument a palimpsest. Rome celebrated its triumph, but it had built its glory on bones. Time passed. Generations came and went. The Punic tongue fell silent, the shrines crumbled. But sometimes, when the light struck just right, a shape on the horizon resembled something older. A street corner curved too perfectly. A shadow clung to the walls of Bursa too long. Carthage was not haunting Rome. It was reminding it. Reminding that destruction is never truly final. That beneath every new empire lies the ghost of an old one, and that memory, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way back to the surface. Chapter 17. The Eternal Echo of Carthage. Carthage once shimmered like a jewel upon the Mediterranean's edge. Traders from distant shores docked in its harbours, their sails bright against the sun. Markets bustled with silk, silver, and spices. In the air, the scent of olive oil, incense, and sea salt mingled with the low murmur of languages, Phoenician, Greek, Berber, and Latin. And yet, when Rome conquered Carthage and salted its soil, it tried to silence a legacy far too deep to erase. But memory does not bow to conquest. Long after the city's walls crumbled, the memory of Carthage wandered freely. It lived in poems and pilgrim stories, in letters sent across empires, in old maps inked by trembling hands. Those who came after, Romans, Byzantines, Arabs, Frenchmen, dug their roots in the same earth, unknowingly walking over the bones of a forgotten empire. In them, in all of us, the story lingered. Carthage became more than a city. It became a symbol, a reminder that even the greatest powers can fall, but their stories can rise again, reshaped by time and told anew. The memory survived not in grandeur, but in the quiet persistence of remembrance. It drifted in the minds of scholars who pondered Hannibal's path through the Alps. It flickered in the curiosity of children who heard tales of a queen named Dido, her heart broken, her city ablaze. It lived in ruins and books, in stone and script, and in this way Carthage endured because memory, though invisible, is powerful. It can span centuries, cross continents, and hold entire civilizations in its gentle grasp. Carthage was no longer brick and mortar. It was story. And stories survive. A name that endures. There is something haunting about a name that refuses to die. Carthage. The word feels ancient yet alive. Spoken softly, it carries the weight of 1,000 ships, 1,000 prayers, 1,000 hopes. No empire that once rivaled Rome should remain so alive in name alone. And yet Carthage does. In schools across North Africa, the name is taught with pride. Students read about their ancestors who once ruled waves and deserts. They learn that Carthage was more than Rome's enemy. It was an idea. A culture of sailors, thinkers, and warriors, a people of cunning minds and resilient hearts, a name tied to resistance, to legacy, to pride. Elsewhere, Carthage slips quietly into conversations, among historians debating empire, among poets chasing tragedy, among travelers feeling something ancient underfoot. Writers like Virgil cast Dido in eternal mourning, her tale of love and betrayal turning Carthage into a theatre of the heart. Later, Flaubert gave it grandeur again in Salammbô, painting it in rich, exotic colours, reviving its pulse. The endurance of the name lies in its complexity. Carthage was not just a city, it was a paradox, a place of wealth and war, of brilliance and brutality. To remember Carthage is to confront all that an empire can be, glorious, flawed, beautiful, and doomed. And in the echo of that name, Carthage, there is something eternal. As if each time it's spoken, the past stirs slightly, just enough to remind us that no name once made great ever fades completely. Not truly, not forever. Stones that speak. Beneath the quiet skies of modern Tunisia, the ruins of Carthage lie scattered like bones of a slumbering giant. Time has weathered their surfaces, softened their edges, and silenced their voices, but not completely. In their stillness, the stones speak. Walk through them slowly, touch them if you can. Each one is a remnant of a world that was once vibrant with life. A broken pillar that may have lined a temple to Baal. A floor mosaic that once felt the dance of festival feet. the foundation of a house that saw generations grow and perish. These remnants do not demand attention, yet they hold it all the same. To the trained eye, the story is clearer. Archaeologists have uncovered cisterns, ports, and homes. They found amphorae still stained with wine, jewelry buried beside the dead, altars blackened with centuries of forgotten fire. But even for the untrained heart, something is felt. A sense of place. A presence, faint but undeniable. Carthage, though silent, has not lost its voice. It speaks through the alignment of roads, the ruins of towers, the echo of steps across ancient stones. In the museum air, hushed and reverent, every artifact becomes a syllable in its sentence. The city speaks not in language but in memory. And when the sun begins to set, when the light grows gold and the sea glimmers just beyond the hill, you may feel it. The breath of Carthage. Still here. Still whispering. The flame beneath the ashes. Carthage was burned. It was razed and cursed. Its fields were salted. Its temples torn apart. Its people scattered or slain. It was by the design of Roman vengeance meant to be erased. And yet, some flames do not die. They burn in strange places. In libraries, where dusty books preserve names and events long forgotten by most. In the minds of visionaries who revisit the past to understand the present. In hearts that seek identity in a world often built upon erasure. During the colonial era, as Europe carved Africa into artificial territories, French scholars returned to Carthage, not as destroyers, but as seekers. They searched for something older than conquest. They uncovered relics, rebuilt maps, translated scripts. In their excavation, they reignited the ember buried beneath the ash. For Tunisian nationalists and North African intellectuals, Carthage became more than a memory. It became a claim. Proof that before foreign powers came, greatness already existed here. That the soil held more than ruins, it held pride. A lineage that predated Rome, outlasted empires and challenged the silence, imposed by colonization. And now, in a quiet, modern Carthage that lies within Tunis's borders, the flame flickers still. You'll find it in street names and school lessons, in museum halls and family tales. You'll find it in the reverent gaze of visitors standing where once the Punic city rose high. Carthage's true survival is not in its ruins, nor in the records of Rome. It is in the fire of memory, a fire that, despite wind and time and war, never truly went out. It smoulders in the soul of those who remember. It burns in the pages of those who write. And as long as someone, somewhere, says the name Carthage, with wonder or sorrow or pride, that flame will never fade.